Piggies.
At least 13 cities are defunding their police departments. Detroit is split on calls to defund the police. We should still defund the police. Activists call on Chicago leaders to defund police in the city's next budget.
If you would have suggested to me just a couple of years ago that we would ever read headlines like these in an American newspaper, why, I'd have called it a load of disreputable flibbertigibbet. And yet, here we are today, reading them. Well into the 21st century, in these United States of America, millions of people are marching in the streets and calling for the defunding and abolition of the police. The very men and women who protect our homes, our businesses, and our families from the iniquity of crime. It's fantastic, it's unbelievable, and yet, it's true. It's now been 3 months since the George Floyd protests first broke out, and this movement seems to be here to contend with for a long time. But how can anyone want to get rid of the police? What kind of world would it be without the thin blue line to stand between the public at large and those who would prey upon the innocent? It's a troublesome notion.
To help calm your nerves as we explore these troublesome notions, this film series uses patent-pending Trouble Vision technology. As troublesome ideas begin to build, this meter will fill. And don't worry, once the meter is full, we'll take a break and put your mind at ease. And now, back to your host, fake professor of explainology, American Johnson.
Now, before we begin, I want to make one thing very clear. In this presentation series, I'm going to present some ideas to you that you are going to disagree with. I'm going to share information that you will be very skeptical of, and that's A-okay. I don't want or expect you to just believe everything I say without questioning or thinking about it. I don't expect or intend for you to change your mind. All I really hope to do is help you to understand the troublesome notion of police abolition from the perspective of the abolitionist. I'll share the sources for everything I talk about in the description of this video so you can check the facts for yourself and make up your mind on your own. And heck, if you really hate the idea of police abolition, then that should make you want to understand it that much more. After all, it'll be a lot easier to argue against your kids if you understand what police abolitionists are actually arguing for, right? Right. Okay, so before we can talk about police abolition, we have to talk about the police. As you've no doubt been seeing in the news, a lot of folks are pretty angry with the police lately. And why would that be? Well, everyone knows that this specific bout of protests was sparked by the tragic murder of George Floyd. But one thing you have to understand is that George Floyd was just one of countless black people to be murdered by police officers in the last couple of years alone. There are far too many names to read them all, but you can look at the cases of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Jamel Floyd, and Eric Garner for just a few of the more egregious examples. Of course, it's not just black people who've been murdered and assaulted by the police of late. Since these protests began, there have also been countless examples of police brutality being documented on camera against people of every ethnicity, including a 75-year-old white man who was shoved to the ground by 2 police officers in Buffalo, New York. The entire police squad then stepped over his body, showing no concern and even callously shouting out, "He's leaking," as blood poured out of his ears. Members of the press have also been pepper sprayed and tear gassed and beaten by police during these protests. Even military veterans have been victims of police brutality, such as this Navy veteran who was beaten and pepper sprayed for no reason, and an American Vietnam veteran who was pepper sprayed casually by a passing police officer for, again, no reason at all. That's not even getting into the trampling of human rights involving police and federal agents snatching people up in unmarked vans without showing badges or disclosing their names or the agencies they work for or reading anyone their rights. And if you have any doubt that the police have been engaging in brutality during these protests, I encourage you to check out the Twitter feed of a conservative Republican lawyer named T. Greg Doucette, who has been compiling hundreds of videos of police brutality occurring at protests. The links to all of these videos are in the description. Now, you might be feeling upset right now. I'm sure you have some objections, so let's pause now for just a moment, and I hope you'll take a deep breath with me. I understand your objections. It's not just the police being violent. Protesters have been throwing bricks, breaking windows, looting, doing all kinds of violent stuff, right? It's a tough time to be a cop right now, especially if you're in a major city where the riots have been continuous for months on end. Some mistakes are bound to be made, and a few bad apples are bound to crack under that kind of pressure every now and again. Not all cops are bad though, right? Most cops are just trying to serve their communities after all. It doesn't make sense to just fire the entire police force because of a few crooked cops. And this is where I want to introduce to you the very first important concept that you need to understand if you want to fully understand police abolition: systemic violence. The whole idea of systemic violence is that violence occurs, well, systemically. That is to say, individuals who serve the system may or may not intentionally act with violence, but they all serve a system that is inherently violent. This idea of systemic violence leads to the troubling acronym ACAB, which basically means all cops are bad? Now, to say that all cops are bad must certainly seem like an absurd generalization. Of course, every single police officer in the United States of America is not a terrible human being who just revels in violence. Most cops initially join the force because they want to serve others, and a lot of cops do their best to try to help other people in the course of their work. Police abolitionists recognize this. However, police abolitionists argue that it doesn't matter if an individual cop is good or bad as an individual. What matters is that their jobs require them to serve a violent and oppressive institution of systemic violence, which we call the police. This is an extreme example, but perhaps it will help you to understand. Not every single German soldier who worked at the Auschwitz concentration camp during the Holocaust was a violent camp guard. There were German soldiers working as secretaries and mechanics and various other jobs that had nothing to do with murdering or torturing Holocaust victims directly. But I think you would probably agree that everyone who worked at Auschwitz concentration camp was serving a very bad system, and they all had a moral obligation not to serve the system. Now, I'm not equating the police in the USA to the Auschwitz concentration camp. I'm just trying to make you understand that some systems are inherently bad, and working to serve such systems can't be morally justified no matter what the position within the system might be. As it was decided at the Nuremberg trials for Nazis, saying that you were just doing your job or just following orders was no excuse for committing crimes against humanity. It was true then, and abolitionists believe it's true today. So if we can agree that nobody should serve an inherently violent and oppressive system, we next have to decide if the police in the USA are an inherently violent and oppressive system. This is a complicated question, and before we can answer it, we first have to understand why the police exist and what the police force is designed to do. So first, let's take a short walk through the history of American policing. The very first constabulary services in what we now call the USA were actually put together before the American Revolution, and they were set up to protect the institutions of colonization and slavery. Indian constables were set up to police Native Americans in colonial New England in the 1600s, and in 1704, slave patrols were first set up in the Carolina colony. The Indian constables kept the local Native Americans suppressed so that white settlers could expand and solidify their territory. The slave patrols existed to catch escaped slaves and punish them before turning them back in to their masters. These slave patrols lasted for decades until slavery was finally abolished at the end of the Civil War. In their place, the Ku Klux Klan was quickly formed to intimidate and suppress freed slaves. The KKK
Hide the memes, I'm
became
back.
notorious for
Hide the
assaulting
memes.
and lynching black men, often for no reason at all. Throughout this period, the police forces evolved, often directly from the same forces which began as Indian constables and slave patrols, and in much of the South, the KKK had direct ties with early police forces, which would extend well into the 1960s and even persist in some places to this very day. In 1947, it was estimated that 1/4 of the Atlanta Police Department were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Then Mayor William B. Hartsfield
Excuse me, I do understand what pogo means. It means weird champ, but softer.
decided to let black people join the police force to get more votes from the black residents of Atlanta, and the first black officers were thus commissioned in 1938. However, these black officers were forced to work out of a YMCA gymnasium to avoid conflict with the white officers, and the newly minted black officers were not allowed to arrest white people. The black officers were constantly harassed by white officers who regularly tried to run them over with their vehicles and harassed them incessantly. One white officer even proposed a $200 bounty to anyone who could kill a black police officer. Such racial divisions were not exclusive to the South, mind you. Metropolitan police forces began to
Poor
be founded in the
Norm.
early 19th century. Boston's police force was founded in 1838, and the New York Police Department was founded in 1845. But even these
Find the
police
weird
forces
champ?
did
I
not
found
allow
it.
any black officers until 1911. W.E.B. Du Bois was a black
I'm not
American
laughing at
social
systemic
scientist who
oppression.
pioneered some of the world's earliest work on sociological data gathering and analysis, covering subjects such as wealth inequality, race inequality, and crime. Du Bois documented the extensive history of criminalization and unequal treatment of black people under the law in the United States of America. Du Bois pointed out that black people in colonial America were subjected to special trials and punishments that were far more strict and harsh than what white people faced for the same crimes, a tradition which would continue through the centuries and into our present day. Du Bois was one of the first criminologists to use hard data to analyze the criminal justice system. Taking a look at early 19th century prison rates, Du Bois concluded that systemic discrimination existed against black people in the USA as they were arrested for less cause and given longer sentences than whites. Du Bois also did pioneering work on analyzing social conditions and data to try to understand why black people in the USA tended to have higher levels of crime, arrest, and imprisonment than the white population. He pointed out that in Philadelphia, black people were given very little opportunity to earn decent wages, and black people were not permitted to attend most of the best schools. Only menial labor was available to most of the black community, and even then there was not much honest work available for the black community, and so criminal activities were some of the only avenues available for earning money and surviving for a large segment of this population in the United States at that time. In the 19th century, Du Bois was one of the first sociologists to use scientific data analysis like this to try to understand the social forces that lead to suffering and crime in our society, and we can see that from the very beginning, race has become a major factor in income, and income is linked strongly with crime in America. The wealth gap between white and black families is still incredibly apparent throughout American society, with white families having an average net worth of about $171,000, about 10 times higher than a typical black family's net worth of $17,150. So it's pretty obvious that black people, having much less access to wealth and education than white people, have fewer economic opportunities, and this explains why black people are more likely to have to resort to crime just to survive. It's a survival strategy. After all, poor people of all races are more likely to be imprisoned, and income equality is intrinsically linked to crime in communities regardless of racial composition. So it's not that black people are more likely to commit crime, it's that black people are more likely to be poor, and poor people across the board are more likely to commit crime. But even this does not explain the discrepancy in police violence against black people, or the much higher conviction rates and much longer prison sentences black people get versus white people for committing the same crimes.
Oh,
Nor
Clear
does it
Joker,
explain
you're
why
here.
black people
Good.
are 2.5 times more likely to be murdered by the police than white people, and black people are 1.5 times more likely to be unarmed when murdered by the police than white people. And police use force in general against black people 7 times more often than they do against white people. Okay, let's slow down. I know I've been throwing a lot of statistics your way, and you might have some statistics of your own that you'd like to use in refutation. Remember, I'm just trying to help you understand the perspective of police abolitionists who believe that our police system suffers from systemic injustice. But police abolitionists aren't only concerned with race. You see, as black people were suffering under police discrimination in black communities across the United States throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, organized labor activists, mostly immigrants, were also struggling against police injustice. 19th century police forces were commonly used to suppress the working class and the burgeoning organized labor movement of the era. In 1886, the police were used to violently suppress a workers' uprising in Haymarket Square in Chicago. I just happen to have another video that goes into more detail about police suppression during this time, including the full story of the Haymarket Massacre, but for now, suffice to say that the police were instrumental in keeping workers from striking and organizing throughout the 19th and early 20th century. One of the first modern state police forces in the USA was the Pennsylvania State Police. This force was modeled after the American military control tactics established in the Philippines by the United States Philippine Constabulary. The Pennsylvania State Police existed
Fuck is a
primarily to suppress
constabulary?
foreigners and organized workers. One of the chief priorities of the Pennsylvania State Police was to violently suppress striking and organizing foreign workers in the mines that peppered Pennsylvania. The motto of the Pennsylvania State Police was, "One American can lick 100 foreigners," and they referred to themselves as the Black Hussars and the Cossacks. These police officers were instrumental in keeping foreign workers from practicing collective bargaining or fighting for better work conditions in the mines. It is this kind of suppression based on class that led working class movements of the 19th century to utterly despise the police. Some of the earliest police and prison abolitionists came from these workers' movements, including early anarchists like Pyotr Kropotkin. Whoa, let's take another deep breath.
Kropotkin.
I know I just said anarchist, and that's a very troublesome word. Please, don't panic. In the near future, we will put out a whole series to explain anarchism in detail. But for the time being, if you really want to try to understand what anarchism means to anarchists, you can watch this video by Thought Slime about misperceptions about anarchists. Link in the description.
Aw,
for
nice.
now, just try not to focus too much on the scary word. Focus on the ideas. Anyway, one of the most prominent police abolitionists of the 19th century was the anarchist Pyotr Kropotkin. Now, something you should understand about Kropotkin in the 19th century is that he wasn't seen as a scary guy at the time. He was more akin to a rock star. When he toured the United States, he was greeted by massive crowds of working class fans who saw him as a voice of reason during a period of grave injustice against the working class. Kropotkin believed that an overemphasis on law and order in modern society has led to authoritarianism and a brutal state monopoly on violence. As Kropotkin put it, "We see lawmakers legislating without knowing what their laws are about. Today, voting a law on the sanitation of towns without the faintest notion of hygiene. Tomorrow, making regulations for the armament of troops without so much as
Kropotkin was
understanding
the ultimate
gun.
class traitor
Making
for the better.
education without ever having given a single lesson of any sort, or even an honest education to their own children. Legislating in all directions, but never forgetting the penalties to be meted out." In other words, Kropotkin questioned the legitimacy of elected officials writing laws about matters they knew nothing about, and arbitrarily deciding what the punishments would be for failure to follow those illegitimate laws. Kropotkin continued, "Only compare the misdeeds accomplished in the name of each law with the good it has been able to effect, and weigh carefully both good and evil, and you will see if we are right." In other words, Kropotkin argued that the way laws are written and enforced in our current society does way more harm than good. Some of the first groups to officially call for the abolition of police in the USA were militant labor unions like the IWW and United Mine Workers, who sought to abolish the previously mentioned ultra-violent Pennsylvania State Police in the early 20th century. In 1916, the state police arrested all 262 people present at an IWW meeting and sentenced them all to 30 days in jail for labor organizing. Violence committed by the public police as well as
Can't do that
private
anymore,
mining
chat, and you
company-owned
know
police
why.
forces led to a
Hi,
wider
Peanut
spread of the
Jealousy.
police
How are you
abolition
doing?
movement in the years to come. Throughout the early 20th century, there were countless incidents of organizing miners being severely beaten and murdered by the public and private police forces. State police would fire indiscriminately into the tent cities of the miners,
Ewan says he
killing and
can.
wounding women
He-
and children,
he's breaking
and
the law.
officers
He's
commonly
breaking
raped women
federal
in these
law.
impoverished slums. In an incident which echoes the recent shoving of a 75-year-old demonstrator in Buffalo that I talked about at the beginning of the video, an early 20th century trade unionist and Pennsylvania State Congress representative named James H. Maurer
Hey, what's going on,
proposed
Chelsea? How you
legislation
doing?
to abolish the Pennsylvania State Police after witnessing a 70-year-old man being beaten by officers. Now, I could go on and on. The history of policing is full of stories like these, and I could point to countless examples of ways in which police initially emerged in order to oppress various communities with systemic violence. The fact is, the police have a long history of brutality and violence against working people of all races, and police forces in America were originally conceived specifically to suppress Native Americans, slaves, and their black descendants, and the working class. It should then come as no surprise that a system that was built from the ground up to catch slaves, suppress immigrants and indigenous people and ethnic minorities, crush labor movements, and suppress the working class continues to be violent and unaccountable today. Does knowing the history of policing in the United States affect the way you feel now when you look at some of the footage from the recent protests and see people of every race and gender being brutalized and attacked by police, even when unarmed and acting peacefully? Perhaps. Perhaps not, but at least now you might have a better understanding of the mind of the police abolitionist. Now you know that abolitionists see the police as a system that was created specifically to keep certain people from challenging the authority of the wealthy and powerful, and that's why they hope to dismantle the system and build something completely new in its place. But history alone won't help us to truly understand this troublesome notion of police abolition. We have to look at the modern state of affairs, of course. After all, a lot has changed in the last few decades, so I hope you'll subscribe and stay tuned for part 2 of this series, in which we'll take a look at the modern police as we seek to further understand the troublesome notion of police abolition. In the meantime, if these troublesome notions have you feeling stressed at all, you can always indulge in a small piece of dark chocolate. It always helps to soothe my nerves. Thanks for watching. That's some mighty fine chocolate.
Relax and congratulate yourself, you've reached the end of Part 1. Part 2 will be available shortly on this YouTube channel, but in the meantime, if you would like to investigate this subject further, you can check out videos by Softboy Social Club and Car, links to which I've placed in the description. See you next time on Troublesome Notions.
Prince
It's not
Joe.
easy to be a good police officer. The oath he takes
Yeah, maybe.
is not something he can put on or take off like a coat. It carries grave responsibility. It is
Part 2 is
accompanied
not out
by
yet.
enormous authority.
This one was released today, so it might take a little while. Portland last night really blew my mind. After Kenosha, anything could happen, and it did. Yeah, I mean, we're starting to see a lot of agitators show up on site who are in support of Trump, and it is going to cause further conflict. And I think that is to be expected whenever you have a group of people who are fighting for their basic human rights to be upheld, and those who do not want to see those rights upheld fight back vehemently against any true movement toward social justice and equality. So it just goes to show the divisiveness that we have kind of built into our social fabric, and I think it's only to be expected. I think that it is only to be expected to see this kind of clashing on the streets. It says way more about those who are trying to uphold these systems of oppression more than those who are fighting back against them, to be clear. But yes, it looks like some people have no bounds when it comes to protecting their own self-interests. That includes property, white supremacy, the existing systems that lead to further marginalization, and so on and so forth. Scary in a country with so many guns. Is Clue Joker here? Yeah, Clue Joker's here. Well, the one thing that we know to be sure is that even though we are seeing some of these conflicts escalate to gun violence, it's not like there's going to be any meaningful legislation passed. If that were the case, then the second a white guy with a gun walked into elementary school and fired, hundreds of rounds onto 8-year-olds, then we would have had meaningful changes. The fact that we've had mass shootings that have killed children, literal babies, and no gun regulations followed means that this is not going to lead to any meaningful legislation on that front. When can the left arm, or should they ever? Oh, I think that the left should arm now. I think that everybody should arm at this point. Why not? Why are liberals, it's more so a liberal mentality to try to do away with gun ownership altogether when it has been a fundamental rights written into our Constitution. It's one of the most long-standing foundations of our constitutions. The right takes advantage of gun ownership all the time. I think that it only makes sense for the left to follow suit. Guns are bad. Gun ownership is not necessarily bad. It is firing guns in an during a protest, that is bad. Allowing gun ownership without any kind of oversight is bad. Gun ownership without regulations, bad. Gun ownership with no licensing or administrative process, that's bad. Gun ownership is not necessarily bad. There are steps that you can take to try to ensure that only those who are the most suitable for gun ownership do own a gun, but we don't even have that. Guns are bad, but sometimes you need them. Well, exactly. Sometimes you need them. So that shouldn't negate the entire process of going through, owning a gun. Going through with owning a gun. It just means that we shouldn't have a lack of laws that we shouldn't have a lack of laws that would aim to try to ensure those who are not mentally stable or suitable to have a gun do have a gun. That's at the very least something that we could probably get behind, except for the NRA. They are not in the business of trying to uphold any meaningful legislation that would ensure only those who should bear arms can bear arms. We can't disarm after the workers control everything. Interesting way of putting it. The utter lack of gun safety enforcement is probably a bigger problem than the type of guns available. Do you think protesters should own gun? Listen, protesters owning guns versus protesters showing up with their guns are two different things. I used to be listen, I've never shot a gun. I don't own a gun. I've never shot a gun, but I am more so interested in looking at why it might be most appropriate to try to promote the idea of gun ownership during this time in order to protect yourself. That doesn't necessarily mean that you get a gun for the sole purpose to bring it to a protest. That's not what I'm saying at all. You own 2 guns? We've seen the tank top? All right, Tintin, please. Please. And so, it's not even like I'm like a gun nut. I'm not. I've never even shot a gun before. I'm talking like theoretically. Theoretically speaking, I don't think that the response right now should be crafting a plan of action, to go through some sort of forfeiture program to collect all of the guns. I don't know. I'm not a gun.
I bet I could smoke you, I could roast you, and then you'd love it. You text me I love you, and then I'd fucking ghost you.